everyone, welcome back to my Python for Data Analysis series where we cover all the Python essentials you need to start working with data. I'm Urvi, I'm a data analyst, and in today's video we're going to cover functions. A function is a block of reusable code that performs a specific task. Here's what a function looks like, and in this video you will learn what all the parts of this function are, how to write one yourself, and some best practices when it comes to functions. So let's get right into it. So we generally want to use functions when we want to define code that executes a specific task, and we want to be able to call that code from just one line of code. So first, let's start with a very simple function. We'll start with one that prints out hello world. So first, we will define our function using def, which is short for definition, and it is a keyword that indicates to Python that we are going to define a function. Next, we'll give the function a name, and we want this name to be descriptive but concise, very similar to how we named our variables. Ideally, you want to know what a function does just from its name alone. So since the purpose of this function is to print hello world, we will call it print hello world. And just like variables, if you want spaces in between the words in your function, just use a underscore. Then we will define two parentheses and a colon, and then we'll get this indented line here. Now this is where we can specify the definition of this function. And in the definition, we just specify what we want the function to do. So in this case, we want it to print hello world, so that's what we will add as the function definition. And that is it. We have defined our very simple print hello world function. Now this on its own won't actually execute anything. We actually have to call this function. So to do that, we'll go to the next line here, and we call a function just by using the name of the function and parentheses after it. So now if we run both of these cells, this one will actually define the function and this one will actually run the function. The terminology for this line is a function call because it called the hello world, the print hello world function. Now it's also important to note that we can only have the function calls after we've defined a function. So if we try to call print hello world up here before we've defined it, you'll see that we get this error that print hello world is not defined because at this point in the code execution, it hasn't been defined yet. It's defined down here. So we can only call it after it's defined. Now this was a really simple example. Now next, let's build on this and look at a function that takes arguments or parameters, which are just variables that we pass to the function that the function then uses within the function definition. And you've seen functions that do this before. In the last video about loops, we used enumerate and zip, and if you remembered, when we called the function, we actually passed a list to that function. So that list was an argument or a parameter for the enumerate and the zip functions. So for this function example, let's say we want a function that'll categorize a string that contains either a fruit or a vegetable, and it'll categorize it as either a fruit or a vegetable. So we'll define the function the same way. We'll still use the def keyword. We'll name it categorize item. And now when we have the parentheses, instead of leaving them blank like we did before, we'll actually specify a parameter. And in this case, we'll call it item, and you can call it anything that you want. You can also have multiple arguments. So you could have item, item 2, item 3. They don't all have to have the same name, X, Y, whatever. Right now we'll just stick to 1. We have our colon, and then we have this indented line. And here, let's do if item equals apple, or item equals orange, or item equals strawberry. Then we will print, and let's do a formatted string where we print that variable that we passed that to the function item, and we'll say is a fruit. And we'll do something really similar to check if it's a vegetable. So we'll do an elif. Item is a carrot, or item is a bell pepper, or item is a potato, then print item is a vegetable. And finally we'll do else. If it's none of those, print item is something else. All right, so now we have defined a function that takes an argument. So now when we call that function, we'll actually have to pass that variable to it. So let's define example as, let's just say apple. And then we can call categorize item. And we can pass it example. And when we run this cell, which will define the function, and then when we run this cell, we'll see we get apple is a fruit. So when we called the function, we passed it that variable example, which has apple. Then when it came over here, item was example, it contained apple, and it checked, does item equal apple? Yes, it did. So then it printed this first one, apple is a fruit. So that's how you create a function that has arguments that are passed to it. So now let's go even a little bit more advanced with our functions. So far, we've only created functions that print something, right? We printed whether or not the item was a fruit or a vegetable. And up here, we printed hello world. Well, we can actually have functions that do more than just print stuff. They can actually return values that we can then store off in variables. And these are the types of functions you'll see a lot when you're analyzing data. So let's actually go back to this example of categorizing the item here. Now this time, instead of just printing whether or not the item is a fruit or a vegetable, we'll actually return a string containing either the word fruit or the word vegetable indicating what the item is. So to do that, we need to use the return keyword. This indicates to Python that we want to stop the execution of the function and return whatever is specified after this return back to wherever the function was called. So here, let's just return a string that says fruit, and we'll do a similar thing for our vegetable case. We'll just return vegetable. And then finally in our else block, we will return unknown. Now, like I mentioned earlier, when this function executes this time, after it hits return, the execution of the function is stopped and the rest of the code is skipped. So anything that's after the return statement won't get executed. In fact, if we try to add another line down here, like let's say we try to add return, or print this is a fruit, you'll see that this line is grayed out, and that is because we've added it after the return statement. And actually, if we hover over this, we'll see this little box that comes up that says code is unreachable. And that's because if this if statement is true, that means we'll then do return fruit. And once we do return fruit, the execution of the function is stopped and we will never get to this line. And that's why it's unreachable. So just make sure you run everything you want to in your function before you add your return statement. So now let's call this function again. We'll redefine example as apple. And this time, since our function is returning something, we can actually store the result of this function call into a variable. So let's create a variable called category, and we'll set that equal to this function call. We'll pass it example, and we'll run this. We'll see nothing's printed this time because we're not printing anything up here. But when we look at what's in category, we'll see that it contains fruit. And that's because the string fruit is what was returned by our categorize item function. So when you define functions where they're actually returning a value, you can store that return value into a variable when you call the function. And I will also note that right now we just return strings, but you can return any data type that we've talked about so far. You can return strings, you can return lists, dictionaries, integers, floats, really any variable type. All right, so those are the basics of writing a function. It's pretty straightforward. You just use the def keyword, give it a name, specify any arguments or parameters that you want to use within the function, and then you just define what you want the function to do. And if you want it to return something, you just use this return keyword and then return whatever you need to. So now to wrap up the video, let's discuss some best practices when it comes to functions. So the first is something that I mentioned before. Make sure your function names are concise but descriptive. The second best practice is to only include arguments and parameters that you're actually using in the function. When you're writing a function, sometimes you might add in some parameters that you're using, but then you change the function definition and you're no longer using those parameters. Just make sure you take those out in your finalized code. The third best practice is very important, and that is that each function should only do one thing. And that doesn't mean we just need one line of code in each function. It just means that the function just has one distinct purpose. For example, the function that we just created categorizes the item. It doesn't also, clean up the string that we pass it or, add anything to the string. It just categorizes it. If we wanted something that cleaned up whatever is stored in item, we would create a separate function for that. And finally, you want to create a function when there's a set of code you might want to run multiple times, but you only want to define it once. This makes your code much more readable and a lot easier to maintain. This is because if you change the function definition, you only have to change it where you've defined the function. And once you change it there, every time you call the function, it'll use that updated code. Alright, so those are the basics of creating a function and some best practices when it comes to creating and using functions. Next week, we're actually going to start diving into pandas, so stay tuned for that. I hope this video was helpful to you. If it was, I would love it if you considered subscribing to the channel and liking and sharing this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one to talk about pandas. Bye!